Campus Martius because this is, at one time, this was envisioned as being like a central meeting spot for the city. And of course, it's becoming kind of that in a different way today. In 1805, after the British lost Detroit and it became part of the United States, the town burned down in 1805. And Judge Augustus Woodward was sent here by the president, Thomas Jefferson at that time, to administer the new town of Detroit. And instead of starting from the river, which is where the Fort Pontchartrain du Detroit, where Detroit began, he decided to start it here at this point. And they call this the point of origin. It was set up by Augustus Woodward, and he created a plan of Detroit, a new plan of how the city would be mapped out. And it was built in spokes, as you can see. The south and north spoke would be Woodward, he named it after himself, Augustus Woodward. And these other streets that you see going out like spokes was a copy of Washington, D.C. He was attempting to copy Washington, D.C., and Washington, D.C. itself is a copy of Paris, France. So he did that as a nod, as a bid towards the French residents, who was still the majority in 1805. So even though it was under American control, the majority of people here were still St. Aubin, Beaubien, John R. Williams, Joseph Campbell, William Macomb, all of these French people, Louis, Charlevoix, Shane, all of these French people were still the majority and the most powerful people here. So he made a bid to them by creating a new Paris, or attempting to create a new Paris. He didn't stay here long enough to see his plan fully develop, and after he left, other people scrapped the plan and made the city how they want to. But right here, you can kind of visually see the spoke system. Right, we're kind of in the middle, and then you see that Woodward going straight through the middle, and then you got Michigan, you got Gratiot, you got there's Fort, you have I don't remember all the streets now, but you have all these streets that are running into this center. It wasn't called Campus Martius then, but this center of the city where he attempted to create this new beginning of Detroit. So if his system had not been scrapped, this would be point zero. 1 mile from here would be 1 mile, and it should have been Warren. The street Warren, that should be 1 mile. The street Joy should be 2 miles. 3 miles should be the street Plymouth. Schoolcraft should be 4 miles. 5 miles should be Finkel. 6 mile is McNichols, and it still is. It actually, we do call 6 mile McNichols now. 7 mile is still called 7 mile, and 8 mile is 8 mile. So it's kind of a little off because Woodward doesn't run north and south, straight south and north anymore, although that was the original plan. It kind of tilts to the west. So it's northwest. And so by the time you get to 8 mile from this point, you've really done almost 9 miles instead of, it should have been 8 miles. So this was that point. Augustus Woodward set it up. He didn't stay long enough to see it through. But the very important part for this tour that when we talk about Augustus Woodward is because we're talking about this African-American history in this region. Augustus Woodward was the judge who sat on 2 important cases dealing with race relations in early Detroit. One case involved a group of people who had escaped from Canada, from slavery in Canada to Detroit. And most of us think about Canada as a place where people went to escape slavery. But Canada at one time had slavery. And people escaped from Canada to Detroit, and Canada petitioned for them to be sent back to Canada to slavery. And the treaty that the United States had entered with Britain, the Jay's Treaty of 1794, stated that this would be a free territory. Under the Northwest Ordinance, Michigan territory would be free. So would Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin. They were all as part of the Northwest territory would all be free territory. So slavery wouldn't exist here. However, under the auspices of Jay's Treaty, the people who were living here under French control and then later under British control were allowed to continue practicing slavery. So Detroit was kind of different than most of the other northern states. Most of the northern states either had slavery or they didn't. But Detroit had this mixed bag where people who were British or French who were already living here could continue enslaving people, while new residents, Americans, could not practice slavery. So Judge Augustus Woodward chose to view the escapees from Canada as new residents. And since they were new residents, they were not sent back into slavery in Canada. They were free. Well, once that case came up, another case came up partly in response, or partly involving that case. The Macomb family, yep, the same Macomb where we get Macomb County from, William and Alexander, owned two black people named Scipio and Lisette. Actually, they owned a lot of black people, but we're going to focus on Scipio and Lisette. They owned these two black people named Scipio and Lisette who had children. One of the children was named Peter Dennison. Peter Dennison married Hannah, and they were sold to another family. And when they were sold to this other family, the Tuckers, when they were sold to the Tuckers said, when we die, we're granting freedom to Peter and Hannah. So they won't be, now the Macombs of course were French, so they were allowed to keep slavery, and so were the Tuckers. So the Tuckers had said that, you know, we're not gonna keep Peter and Hannah in slavery after we die. They're free upon our will. So in the will, they were deemed free once the Tuckers died. However, the Tuckers also put a clause in the will stating that Peter and Hannah's children would be given to the Tuckers' children. So they would be bequeathed as an inheritance to the Tuckers' children. Now, of course, Peter and Hannah were against this. They were like, if we want to be free, we want our children to be free. They had 5 children. And they want their 5 children to be free. The Tuckers, of course, said no, they can't be free. Peter and Hannah Dennison, of course, finding out what Woodward had ruled in the case of those Canadians, those black people who escaped from Canada to Detroit, they found out about that and they decided to sue their enslavers. They decided to sue the Tuckers for freedom for their children. Woodward was again the judge in this case. They cited the same ordinance that helped free the group of people who escaped from Canada, that under the Northwest Ordinance, there should be no new slavery. The will states that these children will become the slaves of the Tuckers' children. That's new slavery, isn't it? Well, Woodward argued that under the auspices of Jay's Treaty, the British and French were allowed to continue practicing slavery, and that their children, their 5 children, would not constitute new residents, and so they would continue to be slaves of the Tuckers family. However, Woodward also split the ruling by ruling that Peter and Hannah Dennison would be free immediately. So instead of Peter and Hannah having to wait until the Tuckers died to get their freedom, Peter and Hannah became free immediately, but their 5 children were deemed to continue slavery forever. Of course, somehow, some way, the 5 children of Peter and Hannah Dennison ended up in Canada. They didn't stay much longer in Detroit, and Canada had a similar ruling at that time that new slavery was going to be stopped in Canada. Although people were still practicing slavery, there would be no new slavery, so the Dennison children who made it over to Canada were free. The famous member of, well, Peter, of course, became the first black leader in Detroit. That's #1, suing his slave master. I mean, that was unheard of in 1807. This is 1807 we're talking. So before Dred Scott would do something similar in 1857, making it all the way to the Supreme Court, and we have the so-called Dred Scott decision. But 50 years before that, Peter Dennison here in Detroit had already done that. He ended up becoming the leader of the black militia here. William Hull, the governor, chose him as the leader of the black militia. He fought, became one of the leaders of the black militia during the War of 1812, which was considered a war of British aggression again against the United States, and began to use his leadership to start something here in Detroit that will one day be called, it wasn't called that in 1807, but it one day would be called the Underground Railroad. So Peter Dennison would be the first or one of the earliest initial leaders that we have of what would one day be called an abolitionist movement in Detroit. From that point forward, the abolitionist movement in Detroit, although it had people who were white and people who were black, was led primarily by black people who had been enslaved or who had escaped from slavery. So Peter Dennison becoming that first person becomes the first black leader of Detroit. Now his daughter, Elizabeth Dennison IV, would come back to Detroit, and she would actually become pretty wealthy. And she would leave in her will, because she became an Episcopalian, in her will she would leave that her money should be used to start an Episcopal church in the Detroit area. And St. James Episcopal Church on Grosse Ile was started by a black woman, Elizabeth Dennison IV. Most people who live in Grosse Ile don't know that, and even the members of St. James Episcopal Church don't know that their church was started from being the bequest of a black woman named Elizabeth Dennison IV. And the whole story behind how she became not enslaved by her father leading a legal fight first, and then becoming a part of an underground movement to help black people escape from slavery. He started with his own children. So this site is important because Augustus Woodward would be the judge in two of the most important race relations cases in the 1800s, early 1800s, that most people don't talk about, but Detroit becomes ground zero for much of the movement that we call the abolitionist movement, not because slavery was so big in Detroit. I mean, it existed in Detroit. It was never like Mississippi or Georgia, but because of its proximity to another country. Detroit becomes so important in the Underground Railroad movement because of its proximity to Canada, and Canada's history regarding slavery touches and affects the history of Detroit. So that's for this side. And destroyed after they built the city-county building. It was destroyed in 1961. But before that building, there was a little smaller city hall, you know, almost like not much bigger than a nice-sized house. And in that city hall, there was a meat market. There was a jail. And then the city hall had meetings in the building as well, in the back of the building. In 1863, during the Civil War, it is in March of 1863, so after the Emancipation Proclamation goes into effect on January 1st, 1863, and black people are allowed to join the Union Army to fight in the Civil War against the Confederates. This is the touchstone of the first true race riot in Detroit. So I know most people know about 1967, which was not a race riot. It was an uprising, a rebellion. It was not a race riot. Most people know about, well, some people know about 1943, which really was a true race riot. But most people don't know anything about 1863, which was the first Detroit race riot. Now what had happened was, in 1831, the Michigan Intelligentsia and Democratic Free Press, which we now know as the Detroit Free Press, began. It began as a Democratic newspaper. At that time, Democrats, the foundation of the Democratic Party was Jackson, President Andrew Jackson. And Jefferson Jackson was a slave owner. He was a racist, Indian killer, but he's also the foundation of what was at that time the Democratic Party. So the Democratic Party the South was solidly Democrat, you know, and that was for many years, actually until the 60s. All governors in the South, almost all of their congressional representatives, were all Democrats. Now the realignment of the parties would occur, but in the 1830s and